So I'd like to read a piece here written by Moldbug about monarchy, but first I'd like to ramble on it a bit myself. And this will be exclusively aimed at the Americans because you Europeans, you are fine, you understand monarchies, you have built empires with them. To quote the great Eric van Cornat-Ledden, Europe's rise is written in the terms of Christianity and monarchy, Europe's decay in the terms of republicanism, progressivism, and godlessness. Very based. And the Americans, for all the hell they give Europe, need to be reminded they are nothing without Europe. They are the offspring of Europe. The offspring of Europe with a god complex and an obesity epidemic. But as we all know, there is the old saying that history is written by the victor, and so the events of the past are a lot more complicated than we are told by the historians. Now, for some reason that I have yet to understand, the Americans don't seem to think this pertains to their own history. Because if we look at how the American Revolution is sold to us, there's two sides. You've got the American patriots fighting for the supposed freedom and independence from the oppressive British Crown. If you're English, you don't consider these people patriots. They are traitorous, ungrateful rebels. It is not the American Revolution then, it is the American Rebellion. On the other side, you've got the Loyalists, loyal to the Crown, to King George III. And that's it. Those are the only two sides in the tale. Never do you hear anything from the Americans who are not in favor of the rebellion. Never do you hear anything from those who favored remaining under the crown, or why they favored remaining under the crown. And why not? Well, because their opinions are not relevant to the narrative, and so their point of view is never discussed. Totally airbrushed out of history. This is the myth of the Americas. So if you bring up monarchy to an American, now I say bring up, you end up trolling them because mentioning the phrase monarchy evokes this disproportionately visceral gut reaction from Americans, and it appears to be because it violates two core aspects fundamental to the American mind, one being the heroic myth of the rebellion, the other being the hatred of their own politicians. So if you say monarch, they take what little they know about their history and go, didn't we get rid of monarchy, therefore monarchy bad? Accompanying that is what little they know about politicians and their corruption, and so imbibe all of the worst aspects of a modern-day politician onto a king. They haven't given pause to the idea that their system is complicit in the manufacturing of said corruption. They have deluded themselves into thinking they have functioning separation of powers, which is laughable, and therefore a monarchy is trouble. To the American mind, then, monarch is synonymous with tyrant. You can probably make the case that this concept has been especially inculcated into the American doctrine since the end of the First World War and the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And for all of the absurd bluster of monarchical governments being tyrannical, I will bet you will not stumble across a single average American who can name more of their own presidents keeping their promises than can name tyrannical monarchs, not even one. However, looking at American society, it is absolutely falling apart, and I will do my best not to use the phrase Tim Pool as borderline fucking copywritten at this point, and reiterate something Moldbug has said, that the one thing both sides have in common is that they hate their government, but they hate different parts so they won't unite to destroy it, and so it exists in perpetuity, which is genius. Which brings us to an interesting, if quite radical, conclusion. If you look at what both sides ultimately want from a government, the current government apparatus is not fit for purpose for either side. What the left want is out-and-out tyranny. There is no hiding that. They don't want free speech, they don't want self-defense, they want wealth redistribution, and they want corporations to work at the behest of the state. They want to merge the worst aspects of two horrid totalitarian systems. They're basically fascistic communists then, if that even makes any sense. Now, the right, on the other hand, the right hates big government, hooray, states' rights, but they also love the Constitution, because they think that is what gives and keeps their rights. Well, the Constitution is also the centralizing apparatus that gave the government significantly more power, implemented after the Articles of the Confederation proved ridiculously weak and ineffective at managing the state. And, contrary to over 200 years of US history then, the Constitution is not the apparatus that stops the government from bloating into this dreaded leviathan that the Republicans despise so much. And so, right-wingers, you are presented with a bit of a conundrum. You can either embrace the Constitution and its centralizing prowess, or abandon it entirely and replace it with something else of your own making. And that should be an interesting conversation. There is grounds that merit a quality discussion about power, perhaps even challenging the classic right-wing idea of championing decentralized power. Because I do think centralized power is a bit of a red herring. As a right-winger, you are taught, almost religiously, at least in the modern day anyway, Decentralization good, centralized power bad, very, very bad. The issue with this, as Moldbug has alluded to as well, is if you fractionalize centralized power, you birth smaller enclaves vying for that power. You create that dreaded thing called bureaucracy. Now, it seems to me at least that the core idea behind this concept is that the power and the framework around that is fixed, and that is not true at all. The bureaucracy costs money, and so it grows and bloats. There is a balance then between how much decentralization in that apparatus can you afford and still maintain a modicum of some function versus a cost that will be incurred from which ultimately emerges this enormous bureaucracy that ends up becoming too powerful yet cumbersome simply due to its sheer size. And this apparatus is extremely effective at erecting wasteful hurdles that diffuses responsibility and makes it so inefficient. When it's this enormous in size, pinpointing its faults becomes increasingly more difficult because the power is so dispersed. But a business doesn't operate in that same way. If it has excessive bloat in the system that's redundant and hampering the maximization of profit, it is incentivized to trim it. But the state doesn't operate in that way. It is not driven by a profit motive because it has no other competition. They will keep the bloat because the bloat symbolizes power. It has no incentive to be efficient or productive because it is not operating with their own money. It's operating on yours, and so they couldn't care less about wasting it. But there is something else to ponder. If you hear the phrase absolute ruler, your go-to reaction is what you know. You think of a modern-day democratic government and all of its power instilled into one ruler. You detest the corruption of modern-day politics, and so your instant reaction is one of repulsion. The seemingly inevitable modern-day mistake is to equate absolute ruler with large bureaucracy, which is a walking contradiction. But the term absolute ruler, or even absolute power, is very vague. By itself, it doesn't mean anything. It needs a framework for said absolute power to manifest itself in some capacity, because without means or some instrument to exercise said power, the absolute aspect means nothing. I find it baffling that people will shun the concept of an absolute ruler because they can't vote for him or her, that the concept of this benevolent, responsible, monarchical figure is an absurdity, but a massive bureaucracy full of actors that are universally renowned and accepted even as incompetent and corrupt is the preferred alternative purely because society has been duped into thinking through voting they have some say in the matter. Now, this is where things get a little heated. You may have noticed the phrase rights through some unholy fashion has taken on an enormous amount of power in modern-day politics. If you slap the phrase rights on anything, it becomes borderline deified, and as such it becomes unquestionable, unexaminable, immune to any criticism. This is how society looks at voting. It is perceived as this holy act that gives you power. There is no conversation anywhere in the Western world about voting, how it's supposed to work, what it actually ends up producing. Is it good? Is it effective? Is it efficient? Its incentive structure, who and what kind of personality is attracted to public government. None of that, which to me is rather arrogant. If you design a system to produce X, but damn near everyone coming out of it produces Y, it seems insane to me then to purposefully leave the design unexamined for some borderline religious fanaticism about it. Or if not the flaw in that system, what is it about the people going into it that causes them all to come out producing Y? Lenin has this great quote, "People are rarely diabolic or bent enthusiastically on evil. As a rule, they are only weak. They cannot resist temptation and thus give way to their evil drives." And I think that's a much more accurate assessment of human nature. The powers that be, then, to their credit, have done a tremendous job at inducing this mass delusion across many societies worldwide that voting gives them this sense of quote-unquote freedom, when in reality democracy is a farce. It does not work at all. But try breaking into regular society, they live under that level of delusion. You're not going to get very far. But there is this unchallenged notion, because you have the right to vote, because people have fought and died for it, that this is a good tradition worthy of preservation. Never even giving thought to the idea that everything that's despised about government will not only never be fixed by democracy, but that those despised qualities are in fact a feature of it. As a matter of fact, if you want to be a little fastidious and examine democracy as a concept, it is virtually impossible to birth. If democracy is the rule of the many and oligarchy is the rule of the few, apply that to the United States, with a population of roughly 330 million people and 100 elected senators. whether or not they're democratically elected is completely hollow. As it stands now, you're still ending up with the rule of the few, because you can't have a representation of a collective will, especially not with society so fractured and contradictory. Democracies then all have this enormous civil service, these faceless permanent bureaucrats. Voting is picking off mere perceived surface problems. You're interfacing with a small percentage of the apparatus. The rotten core that's the crux of the problem, voting does not even come close to breaching. So voting means absolutely nothing. It's entirely superfluous. Try telling people that voting is not this grand instrument designed to allow the masses to exercise power, nor is it any means to hold political figures to account. It's merely this ceremonial procedure, acting as a sort of facade to placate the masses from violent revolt. Again, you'll be met with fierce opposition if you try. There is this absurd idea of the left and the right being the two extreme solutions, and the center is this magical middle ground where you get the best of both worlds. In reality, all you're getting is lip service that fails to address any of the problems. If the one side is no government and the other side is more government in any capacity, any shift away from no government automatically means more government. The only difference is the pace of that movement. And again, the proposed solution then is always more government. So the whole system skews left over the ages and fuck all gets done. You're merely marching towards a totalitarian state at different speeds over the course of several years and decades. Aiden asked me before, why is it that only we can see this? Well, for one thing, the monarchists are reactionaries. There is a certain social order that many would consider too archaic for modern times. We don't have an issue with proposing what seem to be radical solutions. But I think more why the monarchical types, and even more so the anarchic types get it, is the mindset of how to tackle the problem. The difference becomes clearer given that there is a fundamental disagreement on what the problem even is. The anarchic types look at things like time preference, human nature, the incentive structure, and how does this all mesh with the democratic government model? Very badly. So they conclude the problem is the democratic system itself. They see the design of the system as the problem. So they'll approach the diagnostic procedure much the same manner as an engineer would. The corruption and growth of the system then is not just a flaw of the system, it's a feature. And so they wish to return to or design a similar system based around said incentive structure of human nature. The democratic types, on the other hand, they think the opposite. They don't think the bloating behemoth design is flawed or broken. No, they think the solution is you just need better people to steer the monstrous wreck. They think the problem is the components. Now, aside from the humorousness of that solution, as if no one ever thought of that before, or go deeper and stop to think, what in society might produce said better people? Well, we don't produce them now, so clearly a change is necessary somewhere to get to that desired point. Is there any such conversation anywhere today? No. I think that solution is insane because it requires the great mobilization and highly competent political engagement from the masses, as well as having this high class of morally upstanding political figures to abstain from temptations inherently embedded in the democratic model of public government. Which begs the question then, if you can hypothetically achieve this borderline shooting star level of crystallizing variables to make your system function at peak efficiency, why the hell then are you bothering with the democratic model at all? You have your moral agent, so find your best actor and make him or her the monarch. But anyway, where do we go from here? Policies of the deep right. The only way for democracy to defeat oligarchy is to elect the monarchy. In a since-deleted tweet, Matthew Iglesias asks over that tablet oil painting, what are these new right freaks even for? Like, what are their ideas? I feel like I'm not smart enough to understand things at this level of abstraction. I need someone to tell me, at some point, what specific things these people actually want to do. I love when people younger than me sound like such boomers. He maybe even read all about the principles of the deep right, and still didn't get it, of course. How could he? Honestly, it is hard to blame the poor guy. It's hard to see how most of this stuff even makes any sense in his frame of reference. It's like trying to explain acid to a Mormon. But let me try. Oligarchy and relative public policy. Of course, I have no ideas at all, not in Iglesias' sense of the term at least. The model of political discourse in which public policy ideas are relevant because they are prestigious, and prestigious because they are relevant, is the mode of discourse fundamental to the ordinary liberal pundit's frame of reference. Ideas outside the cycle do not matter, and cannot be either relevant or prestigious. They are not ideas. A key aspect of this model is the relevant nature of the idea. An idea is a change or delta from the present state of affairs. The greater this delta, the less relevant. We can speak of an art of relative public policy, which describes not what the state should do, but what it could change to do, often not very realistically. Matthew Iglesias is a certified wonk in this fine important art of relative public policy. But relative public policy is specific to the second of the three Aristotelian forms of government, which makes sense as that form happens to be the form we have now. The second form is called oligarchy, the rule of the few. Confusingly, its proponents call it democracy. This should not be enough to make you confuse it with the third Aristotelian form, democracy, the rule of the many, which everyone calls populism. Democracy is politics. It means putting politicians in charge of the government. To the ordinary liberal pundit, no idea is more horrifying. Imagine giving the president power to hire or fire, fund or defund, or organize or reorganize any department in D.C. Imagine making Donald Trump the literal CEO of the executive branch. Okay, this is exactly what it says in the Constitution, but come on, isn't it a living Constitution? Instead, when we want a foreign policy, we consult respected foreign policy experts, professors at top schools, of course. Who should we consult? Plumbers, hotel entrepreneurs, such as oligarchy, the hereditary creed of Matthew Iglesias. Are these top schools mentioned in the Constitution? Enumerated even? Why, of course not. Why would they need to be? Cease to talk to us of your Constitution. We have one of our own, and ours actually says what it means. Hier ist kein Warum. Monarchy and absolute public policy. But oligarchy and democracy are only two of Aristotle's three forms. The third is the first form, monarchy, rule of the one, which we call dictatorship, which is bad. Bad. Even though monarchy is the most common political form in history, it is invisible from within our present historical bubble. It does not fit in our Overton window. Is the problem with the thing or with the window? It does make one think. But oligarchy and democracy are traditionally hostile to monarchy. However, monarchy and oligarchy can be united by a shared contempt for democracy, and monarchy and democracy can ally to defeat a rapacious oligarchy. Any alliance is possible. Any two of the firms together will usually defeat the third. In any case, the transition from oligarchy to monarchy is not accomplished by the victory of monarchical ideas in the oligarchic marketplace of ideas. Because no regime change happens by itself, the idea of monarchy must compete, somehow, in either or both the oligarchic and democratic marketplaces. A hard trick indeed. Monarchical public policy, however, is irrelevant until monarchy is established. Its ideas cannot be expected to succeed in the oligarchic marketplace. Nor is any such success the way in which monarchy comes about. History shows that the marketplace of ideas is never flat. It is always tilted toward power. Monarchies, oligarchies, and democracies promote different kinds of ideas. While oligarchical regimes do in a sense argue themselves into public policies, it is useless to argue monarchical policies in an oligarchical marketplace of ideas. They will look like bad ideas. In a sense, they are bad ideas, under the current form. So our first idea has to be a change of form, a regime change. A regime change is always relevant because a regime change is always possible, though never safe. The only form that can power a regime change is democracy. But the only form that can operate the next regime is monarchy. Therefore, the process of a legal regime change must involve electing a monarchy, not unlike the election of FDR in 1932. Operationally, monarchy is required because regime change is hard, and everything hard that works in this world, running a company, directing a movie, cooking a meal, is done by a unified authority with a single leader at the top, that is, a monarchy. Politically, democracy is required because only democracy has the political power to put a monarchy in place, that is, winning an election, with a mandate to truly rule. Of course, the current oligarchy has the power, but the opposite of an incentive. But it is not even just that democracy is a terrible way to manage anything. Populist democracy, in the age of the apathetic, uninformed voter, is not even strong enough to keep the power in its hands, let alone do the right thing with it. Monarchy, however, is well known for being able to keep the power in its hands. Thus, the only way for democracy today to defeat oligarchy is to elect a monarchy. What's cool is that this is actually completely legal. Even if it wasn't, we could do it at any time. Like FDR or even Caesar, the next monarch may not call himself a king, and probably should not. People will call him a dictator. People will call him whatever. It is what it is. But it is worth noting that in the American system of government, which combines monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, electing a dictator is the law of the land. By our own ancient constitution, the voters elect the chief executive of the executive branch. It is an old tradition that the president automatically defers to the other branches in managing his executive branch, but this deference is just a tradition. It is not in the constitution itself. If a tradition is not working for us, why are we obliged to keep it? Even if Marbury versus Madison is 2 centuries old, might it not be wrongly decided? Every historian reads Justice Marshall's coup as a coup, not some divine exegesis. Any such change of form will bring a new market for public policy. The newly elected monarch is elected in vain unless he can completely revise the standards, practices, policy, personnel, philosophy, and organization of the old regime. In most cases, he will probably not even start from the status quo. He will create a new structure from scratch. Only minimal continuity of staff is required, mainly in the security forces. In this alternative reality, relative public policy is of no interest at all. The only form of public policy that offers any interest is absolute public policy. The policy choices that are available to any new regime, regardless of the old regime's standards, practices, policy, personnel, philosophy, and organization. In general, absolute public policy is the natural accompaniment to absolute regime change. Historical instances of absolute public policy are not hard to find, even in the lives of those now living, and even those regarded as good. One example is the US occupation of Germany after the war, AMGOT. AMGOT, which begat modern Germany, say what you want about modern Germany, but it is at least in some senses a success, had absolutely no interest in preserving the Third Reich standards, practices, policy, personnel, philosophy, or organization. In some cases it did, it certainly never wanted to, and for the most part, it didn't. And AMGOT was as absolute a regime as the Third Reich itself. It even burned books. Furthermore, politics is the art of the possible, and until the art of absolute policy in the modern world is at least mapped, if not yet explored, there is limit to how far it can be explored in the lab. A democratic monarchical regime change is impossible. Since it has no policy roadmap, it will fail. Since it will fail, it will never happen. While thinking about monarchical absolute policy in an oligarchical relative reality might seem quixotic, history reminds us that realities change. And intellectual work, by making it possible for our own reality to change, can make itself useful in practice. Stranger things have come to pass, and needless to say, all this absolute policy making is very legal and very cool. As Bill Ayers once put it, America is a great country. Salus populi suprema lex. What does this absolute public policy look like anyway? Many readers presumably still think I am dodging this important question of what I am for, and maybe I am. Before the age of legalistic oligarchy, manuals of absolute public policy were widely published. They were called mirrors for princes. Grey mirror comes from this term. Machiavelli's The Prince is technically in the genre, though its ironic and amoral tone is very atypical. More medieval works are very sincere, moralistic, and even spiritual. Anyone seeking a program for this 21st century monarchy would do much worse than to consult these kinds of sources, rather than 20th century economics and social sciences. But the pre-revolutionary consensus on the purpose of government is quite consistent. It fits in a Latin motto, Salus populi suprema lex. The health of the people is the supreme law. By Salus populi, we might as well say common good, the favorite mantra of another corner of the new right. The purpose of a king is to preserve and improve the health of the people, not just their physical health, but their spiritual health, their general well-being. The general well-being of the population is the sum of the individual well-being of each subject. Oligarchies and democracies have citizens who either have political power or, more often, the semblance of power. Monarchies have subjects who look after themselves. The salus populi, or common good, sounds boring and obvious. It is not boring or obvious. Taken seriously, it is alien and revolutionary. Foreign policy. The purpose of a regime is to preserve and improve the health of its own people. To take an interest in improving the rest of the world is to create a conflict of interest. Just as the manager of your condo complex's homeowner association If it sends the landscaping funds to Yemen to feed starving toddlers, remains an embezzler. A HOA is not a charity, neither is a government. Any such conflict of interest creates an incentive for the regime to act against its own subjects. This is a bad habit of governments. As for the people of Yemen, they should be looked after by the government of Yemen, which should not be a dependency, satellite, or protectorate of the United States, or of any nation northwest of, say, like Egypt. In 20th century terminology, therefore, a healthy US monarchy will be isolationist. It will abandon its current empire, not at all unlike Gorbachev discarding the Soviet Empire, and lovingly tend to its own garden, and defend itself if need be. The idea of military attack on the US remains comical, but only the dead have seen the end of war. Certainly, space remains an active field of international conflict, as does drone warfare. But America's main defense job today, which it is of course screwing up, is to achieve the permanent domination of orbit. With Musk's giant rocket, we might still have a chance. Go America! Economics. 20th century regimes, with mostly terrible results, embrace the weird economic idea that the purpose of an economic planner is to maximize the total consumer price of all the goods and services that the economy produces. This is called the GDP, and an increase in it is called growth. To paraphrase Edward Abbey, tumors also grow. The purpose of economic management is this growth, and once it has been adjusted for the growth in prices, then adjusted again to reflect hedonic changes in price-quality ratio, it is the much-desired real growth. This form of numerology was never known before the 20th century, yet weavers still span and farmers still raised pigs. The theory of real growth is that it measures the amount of utility that producers produce, as Wikipedia tells us, a measure of pleasure or happiness. When we measure GDP, we are measuring, literally in numbers, the quantity of total human desire that all the producers in the country satisfied that year. Of course, some desire food, whereas others desire caviar. And what is their ratio of value? By the kilogram, how much better are sturgeon eggs than chicken eggs? How much more valuable would chickens be if genetically engineered to lay beluga? This would be growth indeed. To see how much growth, just check the market price. Yet the caloric value of these commodities is roughly equal. What is especially interesting about this GDP frame is its relationship to another California craze of the 20th century, Buddhism. As everyone knows, the Buddha too spoke of desire. In fact, Buddhists believe, just like modern macroeconomists, that the purpose of life is to conquer desire. And the only true way to conquer desire, the Buddha said, is to satisfy it completely. Oh wait, he didn't. He actually didn't say that. More like the opposite. But anyway, where were we? Of course, the appeal of metrics like GDP is their quantitative, measurable quality. They suggest what Thomas Carlyle called a government carried on by steam. There is real merit in quantitative governance, but not if, when gamed, it creates a disaster. Government by GDP, invented in the UK and US, has led both nations to rationally destroy their own industrial bases, like the bombing of Germany, but self-inflicted. At least no white phosphorus was used, though in some places like in the Rust Belt one might think it was. A well-managed economy does not have a Rust Belt QED. One alternative which might persuade the next regime is a human asset model. The government literally treats itself like a corporation whose assets are human robots. If, beside the land and buildings, the assets of this corporation are human beings, the goal is not to maximize the hedonic production of the corporation. That would be like a CEO running a company to maximize revenue. Sometimes this is right, but only by accident. It is more right to maximize profit, but even this can be a management mistake. The real goal is to maximize valuation, and when choosing between real capitalization and mere market price, choose the former. The company is worth the things it owns. The more they are worth, the more it is. When these things are human beings, they should still be as valuable as possible. Without an active slave market, there is no way to measure human value. But any way of measuring human value will look at least similar to our goal, the salus populi. Consider, for instance, the question of work. According to both macroeconomics and Reddit, the value of work is negative. Work is defined by disutility, so the less work Americans do, the better. According to this Reddit Harvard libertarian theory of government, if the Chinese are willing to do all the work of making our stuff in exchange for pieces of green paper, they are suckers, and we should let them. We get all the utility, they get the disutility, and some paper. What's not to like? This idea conflicts with both traditional common sense and the human asset model. Common sense tells us that work is good for the human soul. The human asset model tells the regime that work, in most cases, is good for the human asset. It increases the productive powers of the asset, which may not be quite exactly the salus populi, but it at least correlates with the common good better than the satisfaction of desire. And on the scale of the nation, producing increases the nation's productive power, obviously making the nation stronger and more valuable. Whereas any nation that consumes but does not produce can be just dropped on its face by the producers. Imagine America if Chinese container ships just sailed to the international dateline, dumped the containers in the Marianas Trench, and stamped their own green paper. What would change for the Chinese? The stamps on their bonds. China, of course, invented paper money. What would change for the Americans? Without either consumer goods or an infrastructure to manufacture consumer goods. Hopefully at least you have a gun. Probably no shortage there. Pre-liberal economists considered the basic task of an economic planner to be the equalization of labor supply and demand, in such a way that production satisfied the human needs of all consumers, and consumption created demand for the human labor of all producers. The goods should fit the consumer, the work should fit the worker. Ideally, everyone is working up to and developing the limits of their human ability. Of course, not all humans are born with the same talents and/or limits. The goal of matching supply and demand is often very easily accomplished by restricting supply, for example, by restricting trade, mercantilism, or restricting technology, ludism. An especially promising approach to the creation of labor demand is restricting old technology, for example, textile automation, thereby creating a market for high-quality, high-dignity artisanal labor. Obviously, a skilled artisan is by any metric a more valuable asset than a welfare client or a bullshit job paper pusher. Needless to say, this kind of policy makes no sense to 20th century liberal economists. This is why flying from Shanghai to New York feels like flying from New York to Rio. There is a zeroth world, and you don't live in it. Instead, you live in free trade hell, or heaven if you happen to work for Apple. One way to understand the impact of technology on economics is to compare tech to a natural resource, like oil. Economists know the resource curse that afflicts a nation in which 5 guys can pump the entire national GDP up from a hole in the ground. Similarly, WhatsApp once served almost 1 billion users with a mere 30 engineers. As technology advances, every labor market loses labor demand, even engineers. And there is no force of nature which guarantees every human a positive marginal product. People can simply be worthless, not just the very young, the very old, and the very sick, but great swaths of physically healthy society. The final implication of liberal economics is genocide, figurative or literal. If you look at the Rust Belt, you see it. Hiroshima is certainly looking a lot better than Detroit these days. Society. If it ever came, every time we fondle our Benjamins, we should remember Obi-Wan Ben Franklin's racist anti-German rants. The time for a homogeneous America is over. Our continent is as mongrel as the pound. It's not exactly Iceland, and without getting our hands very messy indeed, it never will be. And the real Iceland is probably rife with anti-Eskimo prejudice or something. Man, humans, man. But will a sensible regime, a government that genuinely loves and cares for and wants to nourish its precious human assets, work with human nature, or will it try to change human nature? Well, if it's the 20th century, North America is full of many different kinds of people. Some of these kinds of people are organized in well-delineated cultural communities. Some are not. But whatever your culture, a capable regime will value and cherish and respect it, and not try to wreck it or homogenize it with some other culture. For example, one crucial mark of a successful polycultural regime is that it respects the right of every culture to educate its own children, by default and without penalty, in its own ways and traditions. Violating this principle is not exactly the Holocaust, but it does fit Raphael Lemkin's original definition of genocide, just to let you know. In general, a culture should be governed by its own members under its own rules. Strict geographic separation is not needed for this millet or pillar system, though it tends to develop anyway. There is little to be gained by geographic, but not cultural, homogenization of disparate populations. But it is perfectly possible for human beings to live cheek by jowl with other human beings who are governed differently. The relation between all these cultures should be amicable and financially neutral. Economic exchange between cultures should have a neutral trade balance, easily implemented by distinguishing between internal and external currencies. No culture should be dependent on or dominant over another, financially or otherwise. One of the most important cultures in any nation today is the post-cultural globalist culture. This is the most valuable of all cultures in human asset terms, also the most dangerous. It is just as important to treat these people well as to keep them in check. The regime that fails at either of these tasks has numbered its days. Globalists are just another religion or culture. They are not special. In the oligarchy, their belief system became a state religion, almost a total religion. It was as if we had been ruled by Byzantine monks, and declaring that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the sun could get you kicked off Twitter or out of elementary school. Well, every private religion can become a state religion, and vice versa. Not only is there nothing wrong with these people, when they are bad, they're very bad. When they are good, they are really quite good. But power is a hell of a drug. Excluding them from power will clear their heads and even cure many of their strange doctrines. It may seem like a harsh treatment. To be the addicted, withdrawal is punishment by definition. But in the long run, it will even be good for their souls, the salus populi. And does any group of people have any right to political power over any other group? The short answer is no. Mormons have a right to rule themselves. They do not have a right to rule you. You do not have a right to rule them. This stuff is pretty simple. The accountable monarchy. It is easy to describe the purpose of a good king. But why should a king be good? What keeps a good king good? What if he is crazy? Or worse, goes crazy? One answer is simply to note that for some reason, monarchies, dictatorships in the 20th century, had an unusually bad record of bad behavior. We could discard this run of data as an outlier produced by some pattern related to time rather than form, or we could obsess over it. And after all, even if this pattern is unrelated to form, why should it still not be operating today? Understanding the 20th century, a long conversation to say the least, is the only way to untangle this puzzle. But if we discard the 20th century as an outlier, we see that most monarchs are rather sane. Rarely do they go crazy and start executing whole swaths of their population. They may not be good at preserving the salus populi, but they usually at least try. They are often too into war, a failure mode worth noticing. It is also possible to do much better at monarchical succession than in olden days, if nothing else because of fertility medicine. The Henry VIII situation need never occur. This is a modest answer which acknowledges the frailty and imperfection of human affairs, and demands recognition of the extreme perfection and clear deterioration of present affairs. But I also have my own design for building a technically accountable monarchy, a sovereign version of corporate governance, implemented, sadly, on the blockchain. Summarizing this novelty here, though, would be tiresome and distracting. In any case, the question is not open because the law is clear. The American system of government, as outlined in the Constitution, is an elective dictatorship, in which the voters select the next absolute dictator for the next 4 years. Is it perfect? No, but the country has muddled its way through the imperfect before. It may not be the perfect way to hold a national CEO accountable, but if the changes that every voter sees with their own eyes over 4 years, as long as it took to win the Second World War, do not amaze and impress them, maybe this is not the right national CEO for our nation after all. Joe DiMaggio, our nation turns its lonely eyes on you.